I'm Lacey Brusky, and today I'm joined by my friends Drew Casey.
Hey.
Grace Chesson.
Hello.
And Kevin Ferdosi.
Hello.
Today we'll be learning about illegal wildlife trafficking. This black market industry nets an estimated $19 billion a year with the movement of almost any animal you can think of. We're going to look at the push and pull factors of why this is such a lucrative market and has not been significantly hampered by law enforcement techniques. Before we dive into all of the details, can somebody give me, or at least elaborate on what we are going after when we say trafficking of wildlife? This is a huge market, and I think it's important that we sort of start with a base definition of what we're talking about.
Okay, so I think we can start just sort of like defining it in the broadest possible terms. So illegally capturing, trapping, acquiring animals, be they exotic or be they not so exotic, be they endangered or not, to ship them and sell them either in the area in which they're captured or across international borders could broadly be considered what we'll be talking about as wildlife trafficking today. Now, the reasons for which it is illegal to trap and sell a particular species of animal could be because they're endangered, and there could be other reasons. There could be health reasons. There could be whatever. So that particular nuance is open for further debate,
Sure.
And we'll get into that, I'm sure, later in our discussion today.
Sure. And I mean, it's interesting that this is the fourth largest illegal trade after narcotics, counterfeiting, and human trafficking.
Wow.
But it really doesn't get as much attention. So like you already said and alluded to, Drew, that anything can be trafficked, but what is mainly seen on the market right now?
Like what's being trafficked?
Yeah. What kind of animals are we looking at?
I mean, literally anything. I mean, anything that there's a demand for, anything that there's a supply for. And I think we'll break this down a little later on when we discuss what you had already mentioned in the intro, like the push and the pull factors. But first of all, let's just start with the man on the street when he thinks wildlife trafficking, if he ever does. I
find myself frequently thinking about that on the street.
Right. Well, we're special people. That's why all of you are listening to us. You usually think things like elephants for their tusks, right? The ivory in their tusks. Tigers for their pelts. Maybe even weird like Ace Ventura stuff like ostriches, whatever the plural of that is. And Ostrukians. I don't even know. That doesn't make sense. But I a lot of other things can be trafficked. So like the eggs of sturgeons are trafficked for caviar, etc. So there's really a broad range of things that are trafficked. It just depends on shark fins, even pieces of sharks. Like it just depends on what there's a market for.
Exactly, and that's, I think, my next question goes into why are these so marketable? And I know that there's medicinal uses applied to a lot of these, but who's buying this?
Well, okay, so I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons that you would want some crazy exotic animal. Either you want it as a pet, right? And you can't get it through your local Petco, wherever you may be, this tiger or this lion.
Well, and I think the main area that we've seen those kinds of pets, I think, is a stereotype, maybe a warranted stereotype, but a stereotype nevertheless, is the Middle East, where you see a lot of people who possess cheetahs, lions, tigers in their own homes.
Oh yeah, and in South and Central American drug cartel jefes, they who were we talking about earlier? Pablo Escobar, is that who we were talking about?
Yeah.
Swizz, who when he was captured, he had like a zoo, like a personal zoo filled with all kinds of crazy stuff.
Yeah, it can be kind of a status symbol for some of these people.
Right, yeah, the possession of the animal itself could be a status symbol.
And I mean, even normal people too, you can see the desire to have these cool pets. I mean, I had chinchillas growing up because, people,
I always wanted a monkey.
Not the most wealthy people, that's what you see. But even, the common folk, there's a draw with having these different animals.
I think maybe there's for you. I think we established, though, that we're special people.
Hey, people have sugar gliders, or at least I know I wanted those as well.
So that's out there. But then also, pieces of animals.
Using the pieces of these animals for medicinal use. And so one specific example is looking at rhinos. So in Africa, rhinos are pursued for their horns, and lots of people falsely believe that they have medicinal or healing qualities. Looking at even rheumatism, I think is the example,
and aphrodisiacal properties as well, particularly in Asia.
And looking at the facts here, so on the black market, a pound of rhino horn, which is actually made of the same material as human fingernails. It costs, or the price of it is actually greater than that of gold or cocaine. And this is from a Washington Post article that we'll post.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was reading a different article in The Atlantic about rhino horns as well. And we all hear about rhino horns a lot these days. But apparently, 10 years ago, it wasn't a big deal. So it was very common in China for a while for medicinal purposes. It was supposed to make men more virile, right? But in the late 80s, I think, there were bans, and the U.S. government and the Chinese government both, and actually in different African governments as well, try to put a stop to it, and were largely successful. So the price, you mentioned that it's more expensive than gold, but throughout the 90s and early 2000s, it was pretty low up until recently. Mid 2000s.
What caused the price to go up?
So yeah, this is fascinating, and there are different theories, but the demand increased, and that demand is largely actually in Vietnam, according to the Atlantic, rather than China. Their belief is that it cures cancer, and that has nothing to do with Chinese medicine. That was never a part of Chinese medicine, but apparently there was a rumor going around that a politician in Vietnam cured his cancer with rhino horns. I almost said tusks, with rhino horns, right? So that caused a huge increase in demand in Vietnam. Apparently it's also used for like a hangover cure.
Nice.
I don't know if I believe that, though, because, who's going to spend the price of gold on a hangover cure?
Matter.
There are a lot of really wealthy people who I think might.
I guess so.
I think, it's just a supply and demand issue here at the heart of it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why you can see, and we'll post this article as well, but you can see the demand and the price of rhino horns plummets, and then it skyrockets in the mid-2000s.
And at the same time as you see these animals becoming, or a lot of them becoming more endangered, because there are fewer, because, you have the price go up.
Well, I think also I didn't read the Atlantic article, but I don't know if they say anything about this in the article, but it would seem to me reasonable that if you're experiencing a drop in demand, if you're a trafficker of this stuff and you're experiencing a decrease in demand because you think the reasons that traditionally legitimized your selling of this stuff are going away. So traditional belief in, rhino horn powder as an aphrodisiac, and less people actually believe that, so they stop buying it. It might behoove you to create a new reason for, that's what you usually do for what? Your chinchilla powder? What's interesting, and we don't have time to touch on this today, perhaps this is a whole other episode, but the idea of perception management for creating the market out of nothing to sell your illicit goods.
Yeah, in this case, I think that's speculation, but it would make sense. The article didn't go into that, but it did mention that this idea that a politician was cured of cancer was a rumor, right? Not necessarily propagated by himself. But yeah, it's interesting. So you mentioned that organized crime groups, for example, can create markets where they don't exist, and we saw that in our drug trafficking episode as well, or actually no, our human trafficking episode. Which
you should listen to if you haven't.
You should also listen to. It's a great one. Where we talk about human trafficking from Central America, where these organized crime groups are actually going door to door and telling people, we can take you to America, it's a better life there, it's dangerous here, and they're creating the danger.
Sure. So it's instilled by the people who are doing the trafficking. It's a moneymaker. And I think another huge capacity that goes along with any kind of trafficker is the low risk associated with being caught. It is incredibly hard to catch people who are doing this trafficking. They're stealth, they have great cross-boundary networks, and the ability for law enforcement to really protect these animals and go after them when they're spread across huge areas of land is impossible.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's also a variation here. I mean, there's been so much attention put, especially on the trafficking of or the poaching of elephants, that you've seen a lot of efforts even from celebrities in the U.S. So there are a lot of efforts going into increasing the capacity, the regulations, the oversight. So, I think it's a little unfair to say that there hasn't been, any successes.
Well, I think you're right when it applies to elephants, but there are a vast number of other animals who don't get that kind of attention.
That's true. Elephants definitely get the most attention, and that's actually kind of a myth that, elephants are the ones that are most at risk.
So let's look at some others. So we have in the notes, we have just a couple other examples of trafficked animals, trafficked species, and like their market prices. So for example, according to a 2007 Police Chief magazine article, which, by the way, that's an awesome title for a magazine. I wish I was putting that out. But we'll throw this up in the show notes on the website. But they cite an example of shawls made from the fur of a Tibetan antelope. And this is actually fun, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you. The fur itself is called shatush. I'm assuming that's in Tibetan. And the antelope itself is called the chiru, Chiru. But shawls made from the fur of this poor antelope can go for $20,000 a pop. That's ridiculous. Like, if I'm talking to somebody and they tell me that they're wearing anything that's $20,000, I'm just going to stop talking and walk away, because that's just ridiculous, right? So tiger skins.
You would think, but people are
Status.
buying. People are buying.
Well, I'm sure they would tell you if they were Kevin just Googled imaged Chiru, and
Is it a beautiful pelt?
it's a mustachioed broham.
Alrighty.
So tiger skins retail for $10,000 in China, right? So that's a decorative piece. It is a
Well, it's a status symbol as well.
it's a status symbol, right? But they also sell, tiger bones can be crushed up and used in various medicinal concoctions in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. An adult pangolin can retail for $1,000. Pangolin is like a armadillo-looking creature from like Southeast Asia. And then an adult plowshare, which is a type of tortoise found only in a few small pockets of the coast of Madagascar, can go for $24,000 a piece. Those are usually kept as exotic pets by people like Pablo Escobar with his $20,000 shawl. So just as a couple examples of the prices and like what kinds of animals are out there. It's not just tigers and elephants, but it's a variety of things that we've never heard of because we shop at Petco.
So I think one of the overlaps, though, as well, is the fact that these traffickers can use the same routes that they would, or the networks that they have for drugs and people, for these animals as well. They can use the same exact route. So it's a pretty easy market for them to grab onto and to work with the same people they would trafficking anything else, because like with everything else, there's money in it.
Are these often the same people who are trafficking things like drugs and wildlife, or
Frequently, and it's about where they can get the highest mark. I think the where they can bring in the most money when a drug supply chain goes cold, they can rely on trafficking animals in certain regions to ensure that they still have financial gain when there isn't financial gain from another sector.
Well, we see too, so like as we discussed in our earlier trafficking episodes, and as some of our sources for this episode have pointed out, particularly the Police Chief magazine article, which is fantastic because it breaks down and has some great analysis of who carries this out and why. Based on extrapolation from what it takes to actually handle the logistics of trafficking an exotic animal or an endangered species of some kind. But according to that article, the technical requirements for pulling some of this off, so for example, like caviar, you need to be able to refrigerate the caviar in transit. You need to be able to get it across borders. You need to have people who know what they're looking for. They need to know, be able to identify sturgeon, be able to extract the eggs properly so they can produce caviar correctly. And then as we discussed in our previous episodes, trafficking networks have their routes already sort of on lock. I mean, they have the resources, they have the know-how, they know the border guards that they can bribe. They have relationships with people at the border and officials at destinations. And so if you're some sort of small poaching group operating in a locality, you can sort of tap into this larger global network of whatever, organized crime group A that's in your area, and you can use those networks. And oftentimes, as this Police Chief Magazine article points out, the same routes and the same facilitators that move drugs, that move sex slaves, that move slaves for labor, that move counterfeit goods can also throw trafficked wildlife into the same stream. And these are dangerous people and often end up executing, killing law enforcement officials that are after them for poaching, because these are bad dudes and they're already in the drug game. They're already in these other nasty trades. So we were discussing earlier, like the low risk of being caught. Like what drives this is governance issues writ large, right? Which is something that we harp on in
All the
some
time.
degree
Yeah.
in every episode that we've done, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's not just a matter of low risk, but I think it's also a matter of, a lot of times it's worth the risk. If you are smuggling one rhino horn that costs a few $100,000 and the risk is so low, that's it's worth taking that risk a lot of times. And also for a lot of these people, especially the upper echelon, right, of these organized crime groups, they know that it's never going to come back to them. And if it does, they often have enough power to where it doesn't really matter.
This just goes back to how you started this in the more general governance issue, is that a lot of these countries where the animals or animal pieces are being smuggled from really lack the the infrastructure and the enforcement capacity to be able to regulate and control this trade.
Yeah, it's true. So I was reading earlier about tiger smuggling, tiger trafficking in Thailand. And there is apparently a woman who is sort of the kingpin of tiger trafficking in Thailand. She's apparently the head of tiger trafficking in Thailand, and it's been established basically. They've done testing and they know that it's her, and she's actually gone to court but has been able to evade it. Police officers who are trying to do the right thing, often their superiors pressure them not to do it. So there's obvious corruption and governance issues there.
I mean, and I'm sure that you even have in a lot of places government officials or police that are actively involved in or turning a blind eye to it. Maybe they're profiting themselves.
The effect of like governance and accountability, I think for most of the world, is a driver for a lot of the problems that occur, because in a lot of places, the only institutions that are capable of pulling off the logistics of this are the strongman, the representatives of the strongman government that's in place in that area. And that might be a dim view of international politics. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, most places around the world, the country, any given state, is less a state as much as it is just the capital city. And then like sort of just in a border on a map. Like government cannot control much outside of the capital city. And even then, the corruption of the government within the capital city doesn't necessarily make it a legitimate government. It only makes it just the biggest gang in town. And these are the people that are facilitating the crime that they supposedly are supposed to enforce.
So I think what our next question is sort of, what is law enforcement doing to combat this where they can, or what international coalitions are coming together to combat this in a way that is productive? I mean, has there been a lot of movement in a productive way towards hampering this huge industry?
Most shining example I can think of is South Africa has done a whole lot in terms of trying to curb rhino trafficking. But, that's just one country out of many. Mozambique, they're extinct there. I think Vietnam, also their last rhino died a few years ago, or was killed a few years ago. So there are certain countries are doing a lot to try to put a stop to it, but I don't know how many are.
Well, there's a number of, like there are for other issues, there's a number of international regimes in place, international organizations in place, and treaties that aim to combat this from a variety of different aspects. One of them in particular is called CITES, CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, aka the Washington Convention. It was signed in 1975. There's 181 parties, so that's 180 countries plus the EU. That is an agreement among the participants to coordinate efforts to fight wildlife trafficking from a production standpoint. So from the supply side, it's trying to work in their local areas to cut down on the supply of the animals from whatever particular locality. The effectiveness of this, I just don't see it. I mean, as we discussed earlier, CITES certificates can be forged readily and easily by trafficking networks that know exactly what kinds of certificates they need to forge to get stuff moved across, whatever border and through whatever checkpoint. So there's also another organization called Traffic, all of this uppercase, TRAFFIC. It doesn't stand for anything. So I don't know why it's all uppercase, but Traffic International is a World Wildlife Fund sub-organization. And that organization is sort of aimed at the demand side rather than the supply side. So working on social customs, like in areas in which traditional medicine would produce demand for the pieces of endangered animals. They work on sort of diminishing that demand. Another one, ASEAN, has a wildlife enforcement network that I think they're trying to get off the ground. It's had some moderate success. I think that remains to be seen. But I think one of the interesting aspects of this might come from the association of wildlife trafficking with terrorism. So oftentimes,
can I just jump in really quickly?
You can.
Before you get on to the terrorism aspect, I think overall, looking at the different organizations that you've listed, we see a lot of government initiatives, both international and nation based. But then also, I think we've seen growing public-private partnerships here.
Yeah.
So we see, we have NGOs and organizations, but also these private enterprises that are working with maybe organizations in poor countries that don't have the capital or capacity. So we're seeing these, international partnerships that I think, are really, might be having the most success.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what that Traffic International is. It's a public-private partnership of concerned parties that want to sort of fill in the gaps left by other more official conventions and agreements like the CITES agreement.
I mean, you're looking just to go. Sorry, just one more. I guess looking at an example, I know there are lots of partnerships, and this goes back to everyone being worried about elephants as the biggest risk. But elephants and rhinos, looking at game parks, in lots of places in Africa where you see partnerships from Western countries, and then those, maybe working with the wildlife or the game park officials over there to try and partner up and, be able to cut down on the poaching.
Yeah, so I mean, hopefully, these kinds of efforts will produce a need for better governance and issues and stronger capacity building within law enforcement entities in the localities in which these are major issues.
And it's worth noting, too, before we jump to the next topic, is that it is more than just this kind of environmental, I guess, trafficking issue, and that we don't really normally hear about the human impact, in these countries. For example, so looking at the past 10 years, more than 1,000 park rangers have been killed worldwide in defending of animals. So lots of times you have poachers that can outgun, the government, I guess, the government paid park rangers. So, it's a big issue on all aspects.
Yeah, and I think this can be facilitated too by the kinds of people who are engaging in trafficking. So you have people who are doing it just as a business, to fund just themselves, just for the profit. But then you have, like I was mentioning earlier, terrorist and militant organizations will use this to fund their operations, right? Like, so the Taliban has facilitated the hunting of snow leopards and falcons in Afghanistan, selling them to Saudi Arabia. Lord's Resistance Army has been known to to traffic animals.
Yeah, Joseph Kony was tied directly. A UN report came out in 2013 that tied, the famous warlord Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army with elephant poaching in the Central African Republic.
Right. So if there's a category of being a jerk, he's going to check that box in every possible way. But this could be the downfall. So this could be the attention paid worldwide to terrorism, just as a concept and as a phenomenon, is a much more reactive type of attention than that paid to just wildlife trafficking in general. That just seems to be my observation looking through the sources over the last few days. And it could be that drawing government's attention to, hey, this stuff is funding terrorists or militant organizations or anarchists in your area or whatever, could be the catalyst to cause governments to sort of sober up and realize this is an issue that has such a broad detrimental effect to our society or our own governance, and that we need to attack this in order to weaken whatever group is using it to facilitate their operations.
Yes, that's interesting. That's one effect that it has. One reason that we should be paying attention to it. But another reason that we should be paying attention to it is because it can facilitate the spread of disease, right? So Drew, you and I were talking earlier about the smuggling, trafficking of bushmeat, where sometimes delicacy. Either way, the trafficking of bushmeat as a delicacy, that's illegal for a reason. It's illegal because it's unregulated, and a lot of times these animals can carry diseases like Ebola.
The spread of the Ebola hemorrhagic virus, along with other communicable diseases, can be directly traced to the hunting and consumption of silverback gorillas in Western Africa. Terrorists. Haute couture terrorists.
So then one question to go along with this and kind of challenge it, would it be better to legalize some of this or make it, just so that, it would have to go through the regulatory, lots of this, the diseases are, specifically because it is hidden and, the bushmeat or whatever, doesn't have to go through the same testing or regulation.
I mean, with bushmeat, it's difficult, though, because in a lot of the areas where bushmeat is eaten, it's not eaten as a delicacy. It's eaten because there's not any other source of protein in the area. Economic distribution networks for food in a lot of these countries in Africa, as you probably know, are pretty pitiful. And so if you can just go out literally into the bush and snag yourself a silverback gorilla, and chop it up, sell it in your village, you can make a lot of money, and you get your protein source for the week, right? Because you can't just go to your local Safeway and pay more money than reasonable for your protein. So this is an issue that touches on, as everything else that we've ever discussed in this podcast and will ever discuss in this podcast. This is not just a unilateral issue existing in a vacuum. This touches on many other issues: governance, economic issues, subsistence issues,
social, cultural issues,
socio-cultural issues. So it's really this exists in like a network of issues.
So I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us. For more information and to see the articles we've mentioned, just visit mattersofstate.org. You can also like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter to get our updates. Tune in to us next week when we discuss space policy. Thanks for listening.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot.